Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 291 of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. The title of today's interview is Lyme's Rocket Scientist, an interview with Greg Lee. My name is Matt Sabatello.
My name is Richard Johannesson.
You may be wondering why we titled this interview Lyme's Rocket Scientist, and that's because Greg Lee is a former scientist who worked on a wide variety of research studies for NASA. Then he became chronically ill and had to research how to get himself better. Greg Lee is now the driving force behind the Lyme Research and Healing Center, GoodbyeLyme.com, and he's a world expert on using Chinese herbs and alternative medicines and treatments for healing incredibly persistent Lyme disease and multiple chronic infections. Greg gives us very specific information about how to overcome chronic Lyme disease without having a severe Herxheimer reaction. Throughout his career, he's learned from his experiences, and he's been able to fine-tune his treatment protocols to help you get better with the most precise and targeted treatments he's discovered. We discuss all the treatment tools he uses when treating patients and exactly how they work. So without further ado, Greg Lee in Lyme's Rocket Scientist.
Hey, Greg Lee, and welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Hey, Rich. Thanks for having me on.
So Matt and I are really blessed to have you, Greg. So please first share with our listeners the name of your business.
It's the Lyme Research and Healing Center.
And Greg, you come to the Lyme disease world from an interesting place. So let's first talk about your background and your work first as a rocket scientist.
Yeah, I'm basically a nerd, a big geek. And, I grew up here in Maryland. My dad worked for the Navy. My mom worked for the Geological Survey. And so we watched the NASA astronauts going into space. And I thought, oh, that is really cool. They're landing on the moon. I want to do stuff like that. So I played chess and did lots of math problems and, studied engineering and eventually got to work at NASA doing all sorts of fun, exciting projects. Got to work on the space station, Hubble Space Telescope with robots. We had robots big enough that they could pick up cars, and we used them to simulate the space shuttle robotic arm. We would bring astronauts in and they would do experiments on building the space station and stuff like that. So it's really just huge, tinker toys at a maximum huge level in space.
So as a math geek and as a chess geek and as the son of, it sounds like, two science geeks, what was it that you envisioned yourself doing during your childhood? I mean, was it your goal to become a rocket scientist, or did you have some other vision for your future?
Oh, I wanted to go into space. So yeah, I want to ride one of those rockets too, and float around and do all sorts of fun science stuff. And that was like, yeah, I want to do that.
So talk to us about your educational experience during your childhood first, right? I mean, you grew up in the Lyme Belt, right? I mean, you grew up in Maryland, and you're certainly not as deep in the Lyme Belt as we are here on Long Island, and people know that because you speak English properly as opposed to what they're hearing from us. But either as a science interested kid or as a child of two scientists, or as a student in your pre-college education, know anything about ticks and tick diseases?
No, I got bit by the bigger ticks when we go camping, and never just put a match head on it and oh man, take it out, throw it away. Then I think it was probably in 97, 96. I got my first deer tick bite in West Virginia, pulled it out, threw it down the shower drain, and, it's like, okay.
So
didn't seem to get any illness from it or infections.
So great. So you were generally aware of ticks for most of your life, right? You grew up in the Lyme Belt. You were getting bitten by different types of ticks during the course of your life, right?
They freaked me out, because I didn't want blood sucking things touching me, and that was my a little adding to my neurosis being in nature,
Well, we certainly don't none of us like to have things sucking our blood. But of course, the thing that's most challenging about ticks is what they spit into us, not what they take out of us. And were you aware of the possibility during your childhood that these ticks that were biting you could make you sick?
Oh yeah, I mean, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever was one of the things, but that was about it. And nothing about Lyme or Bartonella or Babesia or any of those things. So it was not even on the radar.
So, Greg, we were talking offline, and I shared with you, you and I are the same age, that I was getting bitten by ticks, and I was aware of the ticks, very much like you were. And I was more concerned about Rocky Mountain spotted fever because Lyme disease had not yet been discovered, or at least the alleged discovery of the bacteria by Bergdorfer had not been made public until long after I was aware of ticks. It was Rocky Mountain spotted fever that we were concerned about most. Is that the same experience you had during your childhood?
Yeah, that was the only one I even remotely heard about, and didn't pay much mind to it because I only had a couple tick bites. I didn't have a ton.
All right, so now let's talk about one last piece of this. Were there any steps that you had taken, either because of the education that you had received, either at home, socially, or in school, that caused you to take any steps to protect yourself from getting bitten by ticks? Were you using any type of chemical or other tools to protect you from tick bites?
I mean, we used spraying it ourselves, and that was about it. Nothing more than that.
So let's fast forward to your college education. When did you go to college, and what did you major in?
So I went in the early 80s to University of Maryland, and then got a degree in computer science. And that was part of my NASA plan, was to, go work in aerospace. And I figured that was a good way to jump into that profession. And fortunately, I had taken a class from a NASA scientist, and he was really a cool guy named Paul Lohman. He was one of the last guys who was questioning continental drift in the world. And he was the expert in plate tectonics. And eventually he came around to when I was working for him. I'm like, are you sure you don't believe in this stuff? About a couple of years after working him, he's like, yeah, you're right.
So talk to us about the path from the University of Maryland, which we know is one of the top schools in the country, to NASA. How did that path open up for you?
Well, I, worked with Dr. Lohman for a while as a college student, and made other contacts with other people at NASA. And then after graduating, I went and worked in other companies. And eventually I came back and worked for a NASA contractor, well, actually several NASA contractors on, as I mentioned, multiple projects with robots and the space station, Hubble Space Telescope, climate modeling. We worked on looking at, how global climate change was being affected by man-made things like aerosols and all sorts of scientific research around that. So, just early on in my career, I really got to see the impact people are having on the environment, and how it seems that a lot of people don't want to hear about it, or don't, pay it much mind or want to change their lifestyle, and unless it's legislated or, more of a stronger way of getting people to comply with not, destroying the environment.
So now you have this awakening when you're working as a rocket scientist, and you ultimately now pivot away from doing that type of work, and your career takes a new path. So talk to us about what inspired you to change the course of your career.
Well, as I worked at NASA, there were a lot of really great projects, and sometimes they would require being up like 24 hours straight, because you have, people on the space shuttle going over at 2 a.m. in the morning, and you need to be there and do your experiment because you have a really short window, because they're running pretty much, experiments for like 12, 16 hours a day. So you have a little window to say, hey, we want to do this robot experiment. So And then you're preparing for the experiment, you run the experiment, and then you're, analyzing the data afterwards. So it's a long, time. And over time, I learned, I put my stress in my gut. And so I began to get pain, cramping, and went to the doctor, and he diagnosed me with irritable bowel syndrome. And he gave me some medication, and I left, and I'm like, okay, it didn't do anything. And he says, well, it's stress. And I'm like, well, what do you do with that? It's like, go de-stress. And I'm like, oh, great. You're not helping me. And so I was, having difficulty being in meetings and working. And it was just a really desperate time for me because I thought, oh man, I'm going to lose everything and my livelihood here. And I was like, just didn't know what to do. And a colleague of mine suggested, why don't you try acupuncture? And I said, got nothing to lose. I'll try it. And so I did that. And fortunately, over the course of about 2 months, my symptoms began to abate till finally they're about 90% better, changed some diet, took some remedies, things like that. And I was just like, woohoo, okay, back to work, and then it was working. And then the stress again built up over the next year, and I started to get the same symptoms. I said, okay, I need to make a change here. And, I watched Bill Moyer's interview of Joseph Campbell, and he said, follow your bliss. And I'm like, I don't know. Okay, what is my bliss? I don't know what my bliss is. I'm like, I'm looking all over the place, man. I don't see any, my gut's starting to, do all this stuff. And so all of a sudden it hit me to go help others. It was kind of like this deep insight, kind of blinding flash, like kind of Joseph Campbell kind of just describes it as like, hey, when things just open for you, then doors open that you didn't know were there. And so I went, okay, it's going to help others to heal like I was helped, in my healing path. So I gave up engineering, gave up management, and went and studied acupuncture. And as I was leaving, my manager colleagues were making fun of me. And the engineers that were like, more the worker level, I guess, not management level, they were like saying, man, I wish I had the guts to do what you're doing.
So, Greg, let's talk a little bit about Eastern versus Western medicine for a moment before we continue down this path. So, obviously, you grew up in the U.S. You're a actually second generation American. What did you know about Eastern medicine, either culturally or from other sources, prior to you coming in contact with the acupuncturist that you treated with when you had the initial issues with your gut?
So, when I was a kid, I had an uncle who worked for the government. He actually worked for OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, and he was their China expert. And so he would take bees and sting himself to treat his arthritis. And I thought, that you are crazy, dude. I would never, whenever I got stung by a bee, I'd be like, wah, like, you are doing this on purpose. And so, later I learned, more about the healing powers of it. But at the time, it's just more like, oh, pain, bee sting. No, no, thank you. And so that was it. My family, they didn't do like acupuncture except my uncle or as they call it, apitherapy. They did more like traditional medicine, Western medicine, things like that.
So your background as a child growing up in Maryland was largely, at least from the standpoint of the type of medicinal treatment that you used anytime you were sick or your parents were sick, was Western. You didn't have any traditional Asian medication or medicine practices as part of your childhood.
It was some of the like tradition, I guess probably the closest thing would be even the food. Like some of the remedies would have been more in like soups and stews, like when you're sick, but I did the Pepto-Bismol, the Vicks Vapor Rub, the Wonder Bread,
Now let's talk about, so you decide that you're going to have to make a career change. you ultimately come to this moment where you have this epiphany that you're actually called to help other people heal rather than to build these big Tonka trucks that are picking things up and putting things down, even though that's in space. And you now begin to study acupuncture. And how does that now take you forward with your additional studies in Chinese medicine?
Well, it kind of, when I first got to acupuncture school, I was expecting a rigorous, like, curriculum and all this stuff. And it wasn't at all like engineering school. It was like, opening up, subtle sensing ability through touch, through sensing different energetic changes in people's, color and their sound of their voice. And it was just like, I've been a big left brain analytical type. And this was like really, immersing me more into like a right brain intuitive feeling kind of world, which was new. And it was like, had value because it helped me. So I was like, okay, I'm game. It's not overly difficult like engineering school. And it was kind of fun because, they're mostly, I think, people my age, and they were, into healing and connecting and, all that stuff. So I was like, yeah, I was into it.
So you ultimately went on to study acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine, and you got a master's degree. Where did you go to study to gain your master's degree in acupuncture and Chinese herbal certification?
There's a university in Maryland when I was going, the name was the Traditional Acupuncture Institute. It's now called the Maryland University of Integrative Health.
Okay, so is that a part of the University of Maryland, or is it a separate college?
It's a separate college.
And so as you're going through this process, and you're now acquiring your master's degree, where did you think that was going to take you?
I was going to go help others heal, like I, needed help. And so I when I got out, I actually was saying, okay, I want to work with chronic pain patients, chronic, illness patients. And, I found that because I thought, I had this can heal everything, or this can help anybody kind of belief system. And as real life kind of shows you, hey, it doesn't always work with everybody, especially those people who may have things like fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, those kinds of issues. So I got it definitely with the patients that weren't like, because I had some good initial results with chronic pain and some fibromyalgia patients. And there were some that was just like, I'd do research, I'd look up, other remedies and try new things. And it just, would last for a little bit, then relapse. It'd last for a little bit and relapse. And, so part of that was, studying with other teachers and who have more experience with complex cases. And I worked with some actually blind Japanese acupuncturists for a while that were actually, some were like World War II vets that in Japan, they were not just, okay, you're blind, they said, okay, but you have other senses. So we're going to train you to do healing work. And so they would have their wife show them around. They wouldn't, but when they had really intuitive, subtle sensing abilities that were really remarkable. So, and actually one of them, Mr. Yanagishita, who's no longer with us and around, he was like, short, had, big ears, and he looked, if he was green, he would look like Yoda.
Sorry. So let's pause there for a second, Greg, and talk about when you were going through the master's degree program. Were you trained at all, or was Lyme disease at all put on your radar during the educational training that you received prior to acquiring your master's degree?
So Lyme was not part of the curriculum, because when you're trained in acupuncture, Chinese herbal medicine, you're dealing with looking at people in terms of like what I would call more like natural metaphors. Are they really hot? Are they really cold? Are they really what they call damp, which is the closest thing to like toxic inflammation? They talk about being invaded by pathogens, but they didn't name like specific ones. They would talk about, later when I went through schooling, they would talk about, yeah, this is probably like a cold or a flu or things like that. But it wasn't really a deep dive into infectious disease. It was more like, how do you help a person build up a stronger defensive chi or defensive energy, what they call the wei chi? How do you, if something's gotten in, how do you strengthen the next level of defenses so it pushes stuff out? So one of the ways they talk about when like a pathogen gets in, they call it an invasion of wind. And part of the strategies is to expel the wind. Now, in China, expelling wind is very good because you're getting rid of the pathogen. In Western society, it is not such a good thing to expel wind.
Well, we'll get there in a second, Greg. So talk to us about how this career path ultimately brings you to Lyme disease. When did you first start treating Lyme disease? And then how did you ultimately develop the passion for treating patients with Lyme disease to the point where you open up a practice dedicated to treating Lyme?
So in the beginning, I started treating patients that seemed to be a little more complex than my colleagues were getting because I was in a group practice. And I started getting chronic pain patients, fibromyalgia patients. And, the fibromyalgia patients I was having more challenges with. And one of them came to me and says, hey, I just got diagnosed with Lyme disease. And I'm like, oh, okay. What's that? Lyme disease. Oh, it's not that tick thing, right? Or whatever, it's just like in the late 80s or something, probably. And so I, didn't see much research out there on natural remedies for it. And so I did find that there was similar spirochete diseases in China, leptospirosis. And so there are like remedies and formulas for patients that are infected with those spirochete illnesses. So I said, hey, I got another spirochete illness. Why don't we try these things? And I had initially some very good results with some patients in that they would take combinations of like forsythia fruit, honeysuckle vine, hotunia, a lot of the herbs now that you may see in some of Dr. Buhner's, recommendations for Lyme and co-infections. And this is from, research that was done, in the like 80s or before on these leptospirosis patients. And it's like, oh, having good results. But then there was always a subset that no matter how much treatment or how many herbs I gave to them, they would relapse. And it didn't matter. They were taking like a lot of stuff, and I give them like, there's a couple ways you can give herbs to patients. You can give them as like tinctures, you can give them as powders. And then like the way we're taught in school is you give them the raw herbs, all these barks and roots and leaves and all in a big bag, and they take it home and they boil it up. And, this woman did this, and she comes back, throws the herbs down on the treatment table. And I go like, what happened? She goes like, well, I cooked this stuff up. It stunk up my whole house. My kids complained and it tasted terrible. I am never taking this stuff again, no matter how much better I get. And I'm like, okay, I think I need to come up with a different delivery method. And so, and then I started looking into like, okay, there are powdered herbs, there are tinctures, there's other things, and did some continuing education and presented at conferences and met a guy named Dietrich Klinghardt. And he was talking about putting things into a microparticle. And I thought, that's what I need. So for now, what we do, we test patients for individual herbs and supplements and essential oils. And one of the ways we give it to them is in a microparticle, because microparticles are small. They can go deeper into cells. So you have intercellular infections of Lyme and co-infections and mold and parasites and viruses. you want to get the remedy to where these things are hiding. And in different studies, they go deeper through the blood-brain barrier into the nervous system. Because unfortunately, we do see a lot of patients here with Lyme, neurological infections. And also they go deeper into biofilms. Because, I was at, ILADS, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. And the biggest thing was biofilms. We have to break up the biofilms. We have to, it's just like, that's the, every year there's some big thing or theme or something like that. And so I was just like, okay, right. Now there's this herb called, what was that herb? It was, I have to think about what that was. It is called Haritaki, and the English version, I can't remember the English version, but it was in one study found to break up biofilms, I think, by this high school student in the southern US. So actually, one of my other Lyme doc colleagues called me up and says, hey, what do you know about this herb called Haritaki? I'm trying to use it with my patients for their biofilms. I'm like, I'm trying it. And some of them are having really big Herxheimer reactions on it. And I thought, okay, when I was in high school, I used to work at IHOP. And I sometimes worked the graveyard shift, which is like from 11 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning. And, you go into the storeroom, you get stuff, you turn the light on, and all the little drips of syrup and whatever attract the bugs. And so you're there, you're like, oh, this is kind of like taking the biofilms off. You turn the light on, all the bugs go, they scatter out of the biofilm. And that's why the person is probably having these big herxes. So I learned how to be much more cautious with anti-biofilm strategies until a patient has the ability to detox, drain inflammation, not be so aggressive, because my colleagues were also reporting similar things with other, anti-biofilm treatments. So
hey, Greg, can I interrupt you for a second? I'm sorry. I just want to just back up a little bit and ask you a few questions here. So when you were talking about the microparticle herbs, right? So you were mentioning that you tried regular herbs with some of your patients, they got better, but they relapsed and it wasn't working, which is when you learned about these microparticle herbs. So herbs are just really things from earth, plants, things from the ground that we take that are used for medicinal purposes, and you're grinding them up. What is a microparticle herbal remedy? What does that mean? Is it a really finely ground up herb? Is that the difference between that and a regular herbal regimen that somebody would take?
So microparticle herbs are taking these herbs I get are already powdered. They're usually organic or wild crafted, and taking them and putting them into a high speed mixer, and that makes a smaller and smaller particle. And then we take that, we mix it up with some other things like phosphatidylcholine, and that coats the particles, but they're still too big at that point. So then we take that whole solution and put it in an ultrasound. And ultrasound makes cavitations in the liquid that make smaller and smaller particles, and the particles keep getting coated with a phosphatidylcholine. And so you get these really almost like M&Ms, you have the outer shell phosphatidylcholine, on the inside you have the little remedy. Now it could be an anti-Lyme, it could be an antitoxin, anti-inflammatory remedy. It doesn't have to always be, killing. It could be like relieving of different issues that are the most important thing to treat in the patient. And so the patient then takes those orally, rectally, other ways, sometimes topically, to get them into their system, because that helps them to go have their remedies penetrate more deeply into their joints, their brain, into their cells, and get to the more hidden reservoirs of these, bugs.
Okay, so then you said that you learned about this biofilm concept about a decade ago at the ILAS conference when it became a big thing.
I learned about biofilms way before that.
Okay, I'm sorry. So it was a big topic at the ILAS conference, and you went and you were able to learn more and participate in that discussion. So just again for our listeners, biofilm are the substances of what? So what is, if you can just describe what is a biofilm, because you talked about these things coming out, the Lyme bacteria, viruses, parasites, et cetera, coming out of the biofilm, causing a Herxheimer reaction, which is a worsening of symptoms due to these bugs coming out to play, right? So what exactly is a biofilm? If you can just explain that, please.
So the analogy I like to use is Ghostbusters, where Bill Murray encounters the ghost and they he gets all covered in slime, and his other colleague come and find him, and he's just sitting there in his goo. That's like what I call a biofilm. You've been slimed. And a lot of research has been on biofilms, how they make, pathogens within them, sometimes 100 times more drug resistant. They can collaborate with other pathogens. So you have single species biofilms, you have multiple species biofilms. It's like, this like toxic community or cabal that's conspiring to, live and survive at your expense. And so there are different strategies, like, to break up the biofilms, but I want to have more of a strategy that is able to work in the biofilm, start to take down the bad actors, detox, reduce inflammation, without having the patient have a severe reaction as a result.
Okay, so right there. So you don't want to bust the biofilm. You want to get inside the biofilm, decrease
in the initial phases.
Right, the initial phases.
Right, but later phases, biofilms are fair game.
But I think this is a really important topic, Greg. I'm sorry, we haven't heard this before in the podcast. You want to get inside the biofilm. You want to decrease the pathogenic load in the biofilm and then break it up. So we as patients don't have as severe as a Herxheimer reaction and possibly even get worse, I think is what you're saying, correct?
Yeah, just because, after seeing patients, unfortunately, have bad herxes or have bad reactions after taking strong anti-biofilm remedies, I'm like, I need to get my patients more functional, because they need to be a parent, they need to be a provider, they need to be a kid. They don't need to be a patient for the next umpteen years going and trying stuff. So my mission is, how do I get these patients more functional with the least amount of upset along the way?
And then what are some herbs that you were able to deliver in this microparticle remedy that are able to penetrate the biofilm and get rid of the bad things in there before actually breaking up the biofilm? Can you give us, our listeners, some ideas of the herbs and tools you use to do part one of the biofilm approach you described?
So the herbs that were effective against leptospirosis, like early on, are things like forsythia fruit, honeysuckle vine, Hotunia, Smilax, Artemisia annua. Those are written about as having anti-spirochete or anti-leptospirosis properties, which is what some of the main ones I use with patients in, powdered form, liquid form, and then ultimately in microparticle form.
So why do you start as a powder and then a liquid and then microparticle? Is there
that was over time. That I started with the raw herbs, then I went to powders and tinctures, and then microparticle.
Gotcha. So as you learned and you realized that these microparticles were the most effective, you just kind of changed your methodology as you learned more about these herbs.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's kind of like being at NASA. You kind of have to adapt and overcome challenges on almost a weekly basis. So
yeah. And especially in this world of chronic Lyme disease, where it's never just Lyme and there's really no common answer or common thread. So it's important to be able to adapt and learn and find what works best for patients here, right? So talk to us more. I think I totally interrupted you, and I think it was important to go over those specifics. And thank you for that, Greg. Now you're starting to learn, okay, these microparticles are really powerful. You're able to start work with more patients. You're delivering these herbs in a microparticle remedy, and you're starting to have success. What else are you learning? What else are you doing to help your patients? And talk to us more about all these discoveries you're making in the chronic Lyme community.
So I have to think back kind of in time. My main strategy was herbals, and I always was attracted to essential oils, and I always felt they had potential because of their ability to be very penetrating. So I had a colleague of mine who I actually worked with his wife in a company years back, and I was staying over at his house, which is actually this recreation of this 1800s Chinese house out in Oregon. And so we're staying there, and he said, "Hey, I'm doing a class. Why don't you come down?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And he taught on this strategy for treating chronic infections that was based in China over 1900 years ago, called Gu syndrome. So I'm like, oh my gosh, you are describing my patients to a T. And so he talked about different herbal strategies, acupuncture, something called moxibustion, where you're actually taking ground up herb and putting it on needles or putting it on the patient and lighting it. And that releases the active compounds into the patient. And there's actually this been very helpful actually for Bartonella neuropathy patients. So I can go more detail on that in a little bit. But so I got this whole epiphany through hearing him go through this system, explain the different strategies. And he talked about, back then, there were the normal doctors and there were the Goose syndrome doctors. And they have the patient with a chronic infection. They get sick on the normal remedies. They go to the goo doctors and they get better because the goo doctors realize that these infections produce toxins and you need to detoxify. You need to get the inflammation down before killing stuff. Or they need to be at least a simultaneous strategy to implement because if patients get too sick, just creating more inflammation, releasing more toxins. That's part of the wellness that they found got these patients well more quickly. And so based on that, then there's other steps, like you got to rebuild their energy. You have to balance their heat, hot and cold. And if you've been treating Lyme patients or been seeing people in the Lyme community, some of them talk about they're really cold. I have patients, they come in and they're like 95 degrees. And they're like, I sit in the hot shower for 20 minutes on full heat just to warm up. Or I turn my car's heater on, and I sit there, my earrings are burning my ears and I'm still cold. Things, it's just, there's just such a low body temperature. And I think Klinghardt talked about at one conference how toxins are wicked up into the hypothalamus by the two little appendages that are in the bloodstream, and that disables the ability in some patients to create fevers and heat up. And it was like, okay, so we need to detox the hypothalamus. Okay, well, how do you detox the hypothalamus? Well, okay, then there's different studies in China that show when you have like endotoxins in animal studies, herbs like Scutellaria, which we now know is a great herb for Lyme and some co-infections, has a great detoxifying against bacterial endotoxins. Also, again, forsythia and honeysuckle and other ones like gardenia. So you learn about all these different properties studying herbal medicine because, it's not just about killing infection. It's also about how do we, detoxify, drain the inflammation, replenish the energy, also help with harmonizing the emotions. Because unfortunately, a lot of my patients, they have anxiety, they have depression, they have hopelessness, they have anger, they have frustration, sometimes all at once. And by knowing different remedies that may help with supporting the healthy emotions in a person, that has made the life much easier, especially patients with anxiety. Some of them just say like, I'm the rock. And, I was always, people would come to me and now I'm like, freaking out. Or like one guy was like, I was working with him. He was like a construction worker. He had the Hummer, he had the muscles. I mean, he was like, it put two of me together, I make one of him. He was like kind of like one of those kind of like big guys. And about 3 months into working together, like building up his energy, helping his body, his joint pains, helping his brain, he goes to me, can you help me with one thing? And I said, sure. I'm crying all the time, but I can't stop. And I'm like, oh man, that sucks, And I imagine at the time, working construction, his colleagues are not going to be the most compassionate, understanding people to be around. So I said, okay, well, let's see what's in there. So I kind of talked him into like, when it comes up, what situations comes up in. Well, like I'll see this dog and I think it's lost and I think you'll start crying, or, it's just, it may have been like stuff that's just in there and there's this outer trigger that just allows it to come out. So we talked more about like, okay, what is that? What do you want? He's like, I want to have more control of my emotions. And it's like, okay, great. So what does it mean that you don't have control over your emotions? And it's just like, we dug into this and dug into this. And ultimately it came down to a belief that he doesn't deserve healing. And
Well, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there, Greg, because that's a really, really, really important topic. He didn't believe he deserves healing.
I don't believe that I deserve healing. And when he said that, he burst into tears.
But that's really, really common in the Lyme community. People don't believe that they deserve to heal, nor are they able to heal, and therefore they don't heal. Correct. So I think that false belief is a huge problem. So if you can just expand upon that a little bit more, because that's a really, really common thread on the Stick Bootcamp podcast.
Yeah. So what I did was I said, hey, why don't you try this way of like calling upon whatever you call the highest source of truth, of healing, and use whatever name or phrase. And so he's Catholic, and he said, okay, that's God. So I said, okay, repeat quietly yourself, invoke. There's this concept in Chinese medicine called Gan, which means you call upon the resources of the highest, or heaven. And as you do that, you invoke, and then you resonate with that invocation or the light or energy that comes, and you receive. So he's repeating quietly to himself, God, God, God. And I'm just encouraging him, just keep doing it until you feel something in the place in you that feels like it doesn't deserve healing. So he's like, crying, he's quietly or a little, and then after about a couple minutes, he kind of stops crying, his face softens up, and he goes, kind of like in this little disoriented look in his eyes, I got the insight that there's enough healing for everybody, and it's okay to receive. And that was like a huge moment where that false belief broke for him. And it was just like, and so whenever he had the tears and felt ashamed, I just encourage him, just go and repeat the name or phrase you call the highest and see, is that really true? That you don't deserve healing, or, you're bad for crying in this, at workplace or whatever the different, negative thoughts that come up. And as he would do that, he would go like, yeah, it only lasted like, instead of like, half an hour, it got down to 10 minutes, and it got down to a minute, and then it got down to seconds. So as he invoked and he received from his highest, it's almost like he had more perspective. He cleared the negative belief, and he began to see through the light of the Most High.
Is that the balancing energy component, or am I miscategorizing that term you used earlier, the balancing energy?
It's actually a tool I learned when I used to work for a management consulting leadership training firm called Lionheart. And this is what we would do with CEOs and executive teams to help them come to finding a solution that wasn't at someone's expense, but it was for the benefit of everyone. So it's just a more intuitive, get in touch with what's that core place inside a person that's untouched by illness, that is, what you call their core essence, their, divine essence, or whatever you want to call it, their inner wisdom, and bringing that forward to a conscious level, so they can then look at things through that and see what is true from that perspective.
Okay, so then what is the balanced energy? Because you talked about people are just always hot, right? And they're in the shower and their ears are burning, and they're just whatever, right? So how do you address that? Because we hear that often too. There are a lot of what I'll call temperature dysregulation problems in the Lyme community, and on both extremes, right? Extreme. I'm always hot, or I'm always cold. Is that where the balancing energy comes in? And if so, what do you do from a medicinal standpoint, an herbal standpoint, an essential oil standpoint to help your patients who have those types of symptoms?
So there's different classifications of herbs and essential oils that have more warming tendencies or have more cooling tendencies. And so based on the person and their issues, say they're too hot. And often you see that in patients with Bartonella. And it could be when heat shows up, and when you look at it from a Chinese medicine point of view, it's not always, temperature, heat. It could be rashes. It could be hot emotions like, aggression or irritation. It could be redness on the tongue. It could mean they're bleeding, or, there's heat in the blood. So you can think of, there's many different manifestations of this heat. And that often comes when you have a toxic illness. That is a lot of the, Chinese medical texts are say toxins create heat in the blood or in the body. And you can also see that with COVID too, and how they talk about in China, COVID has these toxins that create heat in the blood that then when they have too much heat, it's like your blood gets cooked. You create this hypercoagulation, or what they call stagnant blood. So you get the blood clots, you get the thick blood. And so looking at, each patient to see, do they show these signs? Is their history, reflective of that? And then we then test individual herbs, which may help balance that out, cool down the heat, and depending on where it is. Sometimes a lot of patients have it in their liver. So they might get scutularia. They might get another herb called lysomantia. They might get, there's, what do you call it? Milk thistle. There's lots of Western herbs that can help support the liver and not add heat to it. Heat may be an indication of a combination of toxicity and inflammation that's just overwhelming that organ.
Gotcha. So now you're in your career, you're learning that you can't just go and kill right away many Lyme patients. You have to support the body. You have to detox. You have to drain the inflammation. You have to balance the energy, right? So these are all the things you're learning to do first before going after and killing the bacteria, viruses, et cetera, correct?
So this is what I learned from studying the GU syndrome with my colleague, Dr. Heiner Fruoff. He's in Oregon. And I mean, this guy is like this Chinese medicine wizard. He goes to China, takes people on these excursions in these like hidden valleys, and you go smell the herbs and get all these, he's like this, he doesn't look like a hippie, but he would be a great hippie,
So that now you have this epiphany though, right? And then you start implementing it in your practice. Are you seeing that you're able to help more people and sustain the results that you weren't sustaining before?
Yeah, in that it's a lot of different things coming together. The GU syndrome strategy, really having a lot more on board to help detox in the beginning, really help a lot of patients, in many different ways. They slept better, they have more energy, they're less brain fog. And then adding in microparticle remedies later on that go deeper in and as antimicrobials or even as antitoxin or neurological regeneration remedies. It's just a matter of, there's remedies, but also how do you deliver them in a way so they get to where you want them to go? So it's been kind of like adding on, not only because a lot of people know about the remedies, but how do you really get them into the brain? How do you really get them into the biofilms without just blowing it open? How do you get them into the cells where these bugs, toxins, metals are hiding? How do you then do that in a way that has the healing effect you want and then doesn't aggravate side effects?
So, Greg, I want to ask you about the intracellular component of Lyme disease and co-infections and things like that, because we do know that the Lyme bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, can change from an active spirochete to a cyst to evade the immune system and evade antibiotics and evade herbs. So when this happens and the bacteria is very smart, it goes intracellular and it possibly changes shapes to avoid this microparticle remedy. What herbs are you using to penetrate the cell and get these non-mobile or stationary phases of the Lyme bacteria?
So when I think about like the cyst form, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is not necessarily using remedies there, because if they're in this form, they're more in this protected state. So I want to transform them out of that state. So one of the things that immediately, comes up, especially in the chronic patients that have been struggling, they live in Lyme, Connecticut, and they're like, I've been having this for 40 years. And so knowing that there may have a lot of these cyst forms, then one of the things is just doing something called frequency specific microcurrent. And there are frequencies in the, this is a FDA approved for pain relief. And there are also experimental frequencies for Lyme and co-infections, and using those to say, okay, you can not only say, hey, I want to, here's an anti-Lyme frequency, but you also have a targeting frequency. So I want to put these frequencies into blood cells, because Lyme can hide in certain blood cells. We know that it can hide in other kinds of tissues. So let's put it into like different areas of the brain. And so it's just having this ability to kind of say, okay, is this creating a shift that is helping, either reveal the hidden infection, or is it, something we need to go another strategy on?
All right, so give us a little bit more about this customized frequency specific microcurrent. I think it's FSM you said, right? So using this technology, does it take the stationary phase of the bacteria and allow it to become into a spirochete form? Is that what it's doing? So then you can.
So there's no research on its ability. We haven't put a dish, a big microscope, and then zapped it with these stuff and seen what happens. There's no research on this. This is more like, NASA brain going, okay, I need to get this stuff or I can kill it. How do I affect a state change in it? So I'm going to try it with frequencies. I'm going to try it with remedies. Also, I'm going to try it with things called homeopathics. So we have multiple, and essential oils too. So, it's all at this point, and until I get some, willing to fund that kind of research, this is all theoretical.
But so many of these Lyme treatments are not proven out by official scientific studies, but they're accurate in helping so many patients get their lives back, right? So if you can explain the thought process, you said your NASA brain, right? So in your NASA brain, what is this customized frequency specific microcurrent? What exactly is the technology, and what caused you to believe that using this, it can convert a stationary form of the bacteria to an active form to then go and kill it in the spirochete form? Can you walk us through that thought process for us?
So you can think of cells, organisms having different frequencies they resonate at. Like when you go to sleep, your brain is vibrating at, maybe 10 times a second or even less than that in different sleep states. And each individual tissue, according to the microcurrent, has a frequency or frequencies that it resonates at. So using that information, you have a way to say, hey, I want to target the large intestine, or I want to target the liver, or I want to target the forebrain because, executive functioning is out to lunch. And so what do I want the positive change to happen there? And so we use an experimental scanning system, which also uses electrical frequencies to scan the body for biggest issues. Over 1,000 different infections, toxins, inflammatory compounds, 100 regions of the brain, functional medicine issues, Chinese medicine issues, homeopathy issues.
Is this your electrodermal scan? Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah. And that is something that actually takes 2 hours to do with patients. And we're based on that information. My job, one of my jobs was I worked in spacecraft integration and testing. So I'm used to dealing with lots of different kinds of systems and making them work together. So like a person has all these different things going on in their body. They're very complex systems all working together. Now, taking that, we can then take the data and say, okay, we know certain things about the gut-brain relationship. We know certain things about inflammation. We know certain things about infections and how they skew the immune system. And so based on that information, we make hypotheses that say, okay, we need to really help this person in their midbrain. Also heal their gut.
Greg, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but if this electrodermal scan is identifying parasites, Lyme, co-infections, mold, mycotoxins, viruses, metals, biofilms, et cetera, how are you identifying which section of the body to treat? Because you mentioned it's, the front brain or the liver or the kidney. How are you connecting the electrodermal scan to the customized frequency specific microcurrent used to then address those parts of the body. Because if I have Lyme, we don't know where my body it is, right? Or if I have mold, we may not know where my body it is. Or am I wrong in that assumption? I'm just trying to understand how are these connected together to use the scan to then connect that information back to the microcurrent to treat parts of the body using this frequency therapy.
Yeah. So the scan gives us what are called stress you can pick up in certain areas of the body. It has not been approved by the FDA for ICD-10 diagnosis. So you can't take the scan results and then go and get, insurance reimbursement and things like that. However, the FDA has worked with the company and says, hey, you can use this to make a educated guess about what's going on in the patient. We'll approve you for that. So based on that, we take that data and, run it through I have a colleague of mine that I work with on this and come up with, what are the areas that are showing up as inflamed, what are showing up as toxic, what are showing up as, and what are the most likely infections that are perhaps showing up in the scan in those areas. And based on that, we come up with a hypothesis that could look like, okay, this person has Ehrlichia, they've got herpes human virus 6, and they've got Marcons in their nose. And so based on that, we'll custom create treatment remedy for that person. Because
but that microcurrent, that customized frequency specific microcurrent, the FSM, that's actually, is that killing pathogens or is it just supporting organs and the body system? What is it actually doing? Is it killing or just supporting or both?
So FSM is only approved by the FDA for relieving pain.
Okay, but I mean, forget about the FDA. What is your
So there are no
brain
studies that
you?
say, okay, here's this plate of Borrelia, zap it with these frequencies. Okay, they're dead. We don't have that. But you could think of, I was an audiophile for a while before I had a family. And so you can think of it as, a life form, like a pathogen, is kind of like resonating at a certain frequency. And frequency specific microcurrent is kind of like the inverse, like the noise cancellation of that pathogen's frequency. And when you give it to them, it has a damaging effect on that pathogen or toxin. It transmutes it, it changes it, it damages it, it whatever, makes it less harmful. But the research isn't there, and just putting that out front. This is
and look, Greg, where we here, Rich and I at Tick Boot Camp, we're really supportive of these therapies. So much of science is evolving over time, right? So we know things today that anecdotally are working and saving lives, but haven't been proven out through official scientific studies yet. And a lot of these things are non-invasive, low risk, and very helpful to the patient. That's why I'm asking you, because what you're discussing could truly have such a positive impact on so many people that are listening to this podcast. And that's why I'm trying to cut through the bureaucratic red tape that you're bound by, if that makes sense. And I'm saying that, not you, right? So I appreciate
you can say all you want. I just have to be careful what I say.
Yep. So again, I just, this is really cool stuff. Now, the scan, you said it takes 2 hours. So describe the scan. Am I sitting there and you're just, and I'm like in an MRI machine? Are you taking a wand?
You have your hand on a blue mouse, a big blue mouse, and it uses galvanic skin response testing it enters a frequency into your system and then reads the response back. So it's kind of like sonar. You get pinged, and then how strong was the return signal? What does that tell you about what it's looking for? So here's Borrelia burgdorferi, or here's Babesia WA1, or here's Bartonella cholerae, and then it's like, woo, what happens? And then that also looking at what interleukin inflammatory cytokines are elevated, or tumor necrosis factor alpha, what regions of the brain are lighting up as inflamed, potentially infected, toxic. How does that correlate with other things like neurotransmitters? How does that correlate with the gut health? And so it's just a lot of integrating several medical models and trying to come up with ones that make the most sense in helping the person to get better and dealing with the most important things first.
So these frequencies are like languages, right? So I speak Chinese, and I'm going to say hello in Chinese, and if you say hello back, I know that you speak Chinese, right? if I am sending a Lyme signal saying hello in Lyme disease language, it says hello back, you're suspecting Lyme disease potentially. And this is what it's like with the frequencies. You are looking for a frequency response back, and then you can target this FSM to then go address and sort of cancel out the noise cancellation component of taking the pathogen and getting rid of it, essentially, right? That's the idea behind these two items, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be, yeah. But not only are there like pathogen, toxin, there's also healing frequency. So a person has demyelination because of their MS. How do you target the nerve sheath to get the toxins out, get the inflammation down, and promote regeneration and healing? This is all experimental, as I, No,
but this is really cool stuff. So you're saying if somebody has damage from a tick-borne illness, which many people do, some people have nerve damage, some people have neurological damage, you can identify potential damage to the human body and organs like the brain, and then find frequencies to help heal that part of the body, is what you're saying, in addition to identifying pathogens and canceling out the pathogens through this FSM technology, correct?
So it's a hypothesis from the
I'm sorry.
data.
Yes.
It is not a diagnosis that you can use for your insurance company.
NASA brain says that's how we should start every question there. The NASA logic, right? But I mean, no, this is really, and again, you've proven this out in your practice by using these hypotheses that you've come up with through your studies and your peers and your colleagues, and then applying these low risk methodologies to your patients, and you see success, right? So that's how you know these things are working, because you're seeing success in your patient population, right?
Yes.
Okay. So now I really want to talk to you more about essential oils, because I have to tell you, a good friend of ours, Margot Gunning, her aunt, her mother's best friend, is a huge fan of yours, and she's obsessed with essential oils, and she's studied your work for quite a while. So she told me I had to ask you about essential oils and the role they play in healing Lyme disease and a wide variety of other things in the human body. So let's just geek out over essential oils for a little bit here. Tell us how you got into studying essential oils and the value they can play, because I have to tell you, I still to this day am very anxious about taking an essential oil and ingesting it. I've used essential oils topically, I've diffused them, but I'm really nervous to ingest them because you read such conflicting information online that they can be very dangerous potentially. So how'd you get into this world, and talk to us about the efficacy in treating Lyme disease and other conditions in the human body?
So I met a naturopath from Alabama, and he had studied a French system where they use essential oils internally medicinally. And he came up with some guidelines. And so I shared them with me, and I started using those, but I still didn't feel comfortable because, again, the research, again, these are very strong remedies, and people would Herx. I mean, they would Herx on them, and I'd tell them, okay, just start with one drop, and they go like, nah, more is better. And they do a big dose, and they'd be like, ah, and I'm like, what did I say? And I'm like, be slow, be careful. But, it's hard when you're wanting to get better quicker. And so then more research started to come out. There was a book published called Essential Oil Safety, Second Edition, by one of the leaders in like the essential oil community, by Robert Tisserand. And in there, he goes over what are internal safe dosing limits for many essential oils. I mean, the book is, probably like 2 inches thick. There's, several hundred essential oils in there. So I was just like, aha, that's what I need. That's what I've been looking for, man.
Can you repeat the name of the book again, just for our listeners?
Essential Oil Safety, Second Edition, by Tisserand.
And again, this tells you the safe doses of essential oils that you can take
of
and ingest.
Many of the essential oils. Some don't have it. It's based upon lots of different like research, clinical use, what's too much use, and it's called reactions, toxicity issues, things like that. He's really done a great service to the essential oil community with this publication. And so based on that, and then looking at, the research out of Hopkins and other institutions that have said, hey, these oils kill Bartonella, or these ones kill the stationary form of Borrelia or the biofilm, and blah, blah, blah. So based on that, we then test patients. So, hey, The scan shows your hip blood work shows you've got, Borrelia and Babesia and Bartonella and whatever. The scan shows this. So what are the essential oils that we know are effective in lab conditions against these infections? So one, we know the remedy. So then how do we deliver it into the patient in a way that it gets to where we want it to go? So in the beginning, we give patients a very lower dose of essential oils mixed with a carrier oil because we know they're very penetrating. They can really blow people up because we've had that happen with patients not listening to slow dosing recommendations. And so based on their working with that and how they react and how they, do, then at some point when they're able to detox, they're less inflamed, they're more functional, their brain's working, then we'll transition to other delivery methods like microparticles or enemas or, things like that.
So when you say microparticles, so the microparticles aren't only applicable to herbs, they're also applicable to essential oils.
Yes. They're applicable to supplements, they're applicable to herbs and oils. Yep.
So how does that work? So you get an essential oil. I'm thinking of I know like the MLMs, I can buy doTERRA, Young Living, et cetera, and buy those essential oils. How does it work? How do you get an essential oil and turn it into a microparticle and get it delivered? I haven't heard of that before. What's the process for that?
We buy essential oils that are made from organic or wildcrafted source materials. They also have a certificate of analysis, which is very important because not only it shows you it doesn't have pesticides and herbicides and stuff like that, but it also shows what active compounds are in there. And we buy sometimes a liter at a time. So we can't go to these, vendors that only sell the little bottles. And based on the research, based on their analysis, then we'll feel comfortable with buying those and using those with patients. And there's different studies that show that compared like conventionally grown, like orange essential oil compared to organically grown orange essential oil, conventional had more pesticides and herbicides in it. So we're like, hey, no brainer there. Organic, wildcraft.
So these essential oils, though, so we had a gentleman on our podcast about a year ago, John Tubbs, who got his Lyme into remission using an essential oil protocol. So do you believe that essential oils are that powerful, where if using the right combination of essential oils in the right sequence, that it can actually bring somebody to remission from Lyme and co-infections?
Yeah. So basically, we're using the same strategy with essential oils. We're using the same strategy with herbs, using the same strategy with treatment and microcurrent. Detox, drain inflammation, rebuild the energy, clear the pain symptoms, calm the emotions. Now the person's more functional. They can handle a die-off more better. They're not full to the brim with stuff that they've from treatment or previous treatments. They can handle it. Their body can drain it out and dispose of it without a big reaction. So then we ramp in the microparticle, anti-Lyme, anti-co-infection, any parasite, any virals, antifungal mold remedies, whether it be essential oils or herbals or supplements.
So you have a whole framework. It's not just essential oils. You're going to use microparticle essential oils, microparticle herbs. At first, you're going to detox. You're going to drain out that inflammation. You're going to do all that emotional work. Then, so you really have a whole phased out approach from, almost a sequential process of addressing tick-borne illness patients that you've built out over your years of experience, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, a lot of it's based on the goose syndrome strategy, because this is what worked 1900, almost 2000 years ago in China to get these chronic infection patients. They probably had malaria or dysentery, cholera, things like that. But still, those same strategies are working today with these chronic patients. Because, one of my patients, they went to 14 different Lyme literate providers. Another one, 46 doctors. It's just like, man.
So I do want to ask you, you were talking about the emotional part, right? The balancing of energy and all those things. But so many people in the Lyme community express how when they got sick with chronic Lyme disease or a tick-borne illness, their emotions go haywire. And I never was depressed before. Now I'm depressed. I never had anxiety, and I had sudden onset anxiety. and I'm a mess. And we know you talk a lot about the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the role your thyroid plays, your mitochondria play, and how all those things together can contribute to your emotions and having that kind of different or altered emotional states. So talk to us about your work and research in that and how you combat that piece of your chronic patients that you deal with.
So one of the things I see over and over again is that patients, even though they may not have a huge amount of fatigue, they have depleted mitochondrial energy. And that is kind of like a core cellular energy that almost always needs to be nourished, fed, replenished. And so we use different remedies, supplements that are things like NAD+. Also, there's a product from a Mitosynergy, which has a copper niacin chelate. There's CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, things like that. And testing the patient for those different remedies, we come up with which ones seem to be most optimal for them. Like I had one woman that I saw recently, she was basically going downhill every day. She was like, I feel like I'm going to, her husband asked, are you going to live? And she goes, I don't know. And so she was like, I got to do something because the Lyme doc, the naturopath, all the other people, it's not helping. I'm going down. So she was so weak, she couldn't even sit up by herself. And, she came in, she has this guy who's actually studying chiropractic now, helping her as her assistant. He's got, big muscles, so he can take her around and do stuff. And recently she said, she's been probably coming about 2 or 3 weeks. She goes, I had another episode where I felt really weak, and I took that Mito whatever product you did. And after I took it, I had enough energy to sit up by myself. And it was just like night and day. It's like a light switch that really showed me how, for her, the mitochondria in her just need this nourishing and feeding. And I see it also not only in Lyme, but also chronic fatigue patients. It's like the mitochondria get hit. And I mean, I take mitochondrial remedies because I'm like, I figure, I don't have Lyme, and when I scan myself and do stuff like that, Lyme doesn't show up, or co-infections. I mean, I have maybe a little mycoplasma, but that, I'm like, I got to feed mine because I'm seeing all these people maybe, that have depleted mitochondria. And so those are the strategies. Also, it's just detoxing the cells because, I think Klinghardt talks about when you get aluminum in the cells, it compromises mitochondrial energy production. So we use different remedies like a microparticle zeolite, frequency-specific microcurrent to begin to help the cells to detox out the metals.
So these are binders to pull the metals out of your cells and flush out the heavy metals in your system, correct?
Yeah. And then also the microcurrent too is an electrical frequency to help expel, detox those metals too.
Gotcha. Now, is there a connection? So you talked about the mitochondria and the energy and the fatigue and people not being able to sit up, but talk to us more about the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and the hormonal element of it, right? Because hormones are really, really an important part of Lyme disease, and people don't understand exactly why this happens. I can tell you, I never in my life ever had an anxiety issue. And when I got sick, I started to have these weird waves of anxiety that I've never experienced in my, my 20 plus years of life until I got Lyme disease. So, for me, why does that happen in a Lyme patient? What goes on in the body that causes that?
So it could be, often in the beginning, it's the toxicity from the infections, and that gets through the blood, can get into the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus has 2 little things that stick in the blood that measure, different qualities of it, temperature and other things like that. And unfortunately, that's a doorway for stuff from the blood to get right in there. And as it becomes toxic, inflamed, it doesn't work as well. And then you get the temperature regulation issues. You get, again, then it isn't able to regulate the anterior pituitary as well, because now it's like, hey man, I'm disoriented, man. I'm toxic. I'm inflamed. I'm not giving you the right signals. And so therefore the pituitary then can't communicate as well to the adrenals to help support that energy cycle. And, if the person is depleted in their adrenals, then that'll often pull on the thyroid and create a hypothyroid or, perhaps a Hashimoto's like condition. But once you begin to use different, microcurrent, you can send frequencies into the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, the adrenals, the thyroid to detox, reduce inflammation, clear infections. So that's one of the main really super targeted ways. There's also animal glandulars made from like lambs from New Zealand, which are supposedly really clean and pure that we use. And then using microparticle remedies that people hold in their mouth that go into their brain, or essential oils that go into the brain that are antitoxin, antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, anti-biofilm, to begin to help ease the burden. Those aren't as targeted as microcurrent, but we're trying to get them in the right neighborhood by just holding them and having them go into the nervous system.
All right, so you've mentioned Dr. Klinghardt a lot in this interview, and we know Dr. Klinghardt studied mold very heavily, and we know mold and Lyme go hand in hand. So what are your thoughts on mold? Is it really as bad as people think it is? If somebody who's sick with chronic Lyme disease is living in a moldy house, do you really think that's as life-altering or debilitating as many people think it is?
I had one of my patients, Lyme, she's in the Midwest, and she's like, took her about a year and a half where she felt like, hey, I don't need treatment anymore. I'm doing really well. I have my blood test results are good from her Lyme doc. She was seeing someone in Chicago and, doing really great. Lo and behold, she tells me this later, her dog chews a hole in a drain pipe outside the house, which then the water, instead of going away from the house out the drain pipe, goes under the house into the crawl space. And she starts having anxiety bouts, especially when she's in her bedroom, which is right where under the house where the mold was. And she doesn't know why. She's going like, what's going on? This isn't like Lyme, And so they eventually found through a home inspector, like, you got a really bad mold problem down here. And they moved out of their house, had it remediated, repaired. And she's like, this was as bad, if not worse than Lyme. And over again, when I see patients that they're like, I'm just not feeling that much better. It's okay. I get better for a while, but then I get worse and it just go back. They're not really able to have a significant improvement. 7 out of 10 times, oh, we found mold in the house. Or every time I go to church or synagogue or whatever, I feel like I get weepy, I get all this stuff, must be something there, and it's like this repeated toxic exposures that are just tanking their ability to, detoxify, get better, maintain their energy. So mold's huge. I mean,
but this patient though got over Lyme disease and was doing well, was in remission. And it sounds like she had a family, but she was impacted very negatively by the mold exposure. But it sounds like others in her home weren't, which isn't uncommon. Many people tell us they have a husband or a significant other or children who live in the same home, aren't impacted, but they are. So why do you think some people are more susceptible to mold even once they've overcome Lyme disease like your patient?
Well, Dr. Shoemaker found with his patients that when he did the human leukocyte antigen testing, that 25% of his patients don't detoxify mold or babesia or other toxic algae toxins very well. And so often that's one of the underlying issues to why some people, like I'm near like an Amish community, not that far. And, some of them don't have power in their house. So they don't air condition their house. And as you may know, you have it's very humid here on the East Coast. And imagine what that does to a house that's not air conditioned. You get mold growing wherever, like in the basement or other places of the house. So a lot of these, communities have homes and families that are just Lyme, mold as their main issues. Some of them, are able to do well and work and do stuff, and others are just more vulnerable and they get hit really hard.
So talk to us about mast cell activation syndrome. We know you've talked about this before in other speeches that you've done and talks that you've done. We've heard about this a lot. This seems to go hand in hand with Lyme disease as well. We've had many people not be able to eat, not be able to be around any kind of chemical, and literally be homebound because of their severe MCAS reaction. So what are your thoughts on MCAS? Do you think it's something that's triggered by Lyme disease? Do you think it's something that's sort of parallel to Lyme? And how do you address it in your patients?
I think it could be a combination of triggered by Lyme, parallel to Lyme, genetics. It's a combination of multiple factors. Mold exposure, definitely. Chronic mold exposure, definitely. And so, it's basically the person becomes so inflamed and toxic that they become really sensitive to any sort of stimulus. It could be drinking a glass of water, and that triggers a reaction. It doesn't have to be, getting exposed to pollen or getting a new tick bite. And so it's really about, high levels of histamine. I remember this one woman, I was presenting her case study, and it was just like, oh yeah, she was the one with the histamine that was like 10 times higher than any other patient. And it was just like, oh my gosh, I almost fell off my chair when I remember sure her reading came up in the scan. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty exceptional. And so the strategy for her was, we need to get your histamine down. We need to get your triggers down, whatever it's environmental, infectious, toxic, whatever. So hydrogen inhalation has been shown in different studies to reduce mast cell activation. So this is we have water we get from our research lab here that is then put through electrolysis and broken up into hydrogen and oxygen. And the patient then breathes that in. It's a sub-explosive level, so we haven't had people have any incidents with that. And what happens is hydrogen is a very small molecule, and it'll go in and it neutralizes, reduces multiple inflammation compounds that you often see elevated in Lyme and mold and mast cell patients. Also, given the study and the research, it also has anti-mycotoxin properties in other studies. So it has this it's almost like this, help calm the system down. I have a colleague of mine who runs an IV clinic in Chicago, and she was saying, hey, I just find my patients just are much calmer doing this stuff. And they get their IVs, they hooks them with the hydrogen, and they're just like having a great time, I've had patients come in and, they have a full on, they're about to jump out of their skin with anxiety and, or severe brain fog. They do the hydrogen, 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, they're like, oh, I'm a lot better. You don't see this anxiousness etched in their face. It's just like the softening, the eyes aren't darting around. It's like calming them down, calming the whole system down. Then also there's microcurrent frequencies for lowering histamine and inflammation compounds. So whenever we have patients that have mast cell, it's really about they're just flooded with stuff, whether it be inflammation or histamine or whatever. We need to drain that out. And then also there's different remedies that lower histamine, DAO, which is diamine something Yeah, I have to look up what that means. So anyway, the real name of that. And then also there's different essential oils in different studies which lower mast cell activation, like lavender. Lavender is like one of our, I'd buy like 10-gallon thing of that if I could. Well, maybe not, maybe just a gallon. And because that has helped a lot of these patients, and they can do it. Either some of them are so sensitive, they have it in a sealed vial and they place it in their pocket, and they can feel the effects of it without it provoking too strong a reaction.
So they take lavender, put it in a sealed vial, put it in their pocket.
We put it in a sealed vial. They take it home. They put it under their pillow. They put it in their pocket, and that is enough for them.
And that helps with MCAS and histamines and inflammation.
That helps them. They feel a positive healing effect from it in
Wow.
terms of calming things down. And then eventually they may try it topically, a little bit with carrier oil on the bottom of their foot. And then, then they work it up to getting it more internal. But, it's like baby steps with these patients. And like, what will help calm down this flood of inflammation?
So Rich is going to talk to you shortly about your Heal for Real community and all the cool stuff you're doing to help the chronic illness community and specifically the Lyme community that follows our podcast. But my final question for you, Greg, before Rich picks up is, I want to learn more about mycoplasma because we read a recent study that 75% of Lyme patients are infected with mycoplasma. And many people think it's really not that big of a deal, but others argue that it can be very serious, especially when dealing with that and Lyme disease. So if you can first tell us what is mycoplasma and what are your thoughts on its severity and how it impacts people that are also battling Lyme disease?
So mycoplasma is one of, if not the smallest bacteria. There's, many different strains. You don't have to get it by a tick bite. You could go into a public venue and someone sneezes and they release a cloud of mycoplasma out of their lungs. And unfortunately, if you're around, you can breathe it in. Now, hopefully your immune system can recognize that and then not let it infect. But, if patients are immune compromised, then they may not be able to fight it off. And so often you like Mycoplasma hominis, Mycoplasma pneumonia are some of the main strains that we see in patients when we scan them. And they'll also assess, is this at a sufficient strength to be a primary thing that we need to treat? So based on that computer model of the scan, we can then apply different remedies to see, okay, what happens when you take out the mycoplasma? Do the other things go down? Often what we find there's one or two main infections that are like the main big, bad guy. And that by reducing them, then all the other ones seem to reduce in severity. So it's just part of the scan is like figuring out what are the most likely primary ones that we need to go after first when we start going after infection. And so, mycoplasma are very small. I often see them in patients with autoimmune illnesses like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, Garth Nicholson, Dr. Garth Nicholson, he's done extensive research on like Gulf War syndrome and, other neurological illnesses as having a mycoplasma component. So it is a big deal, but it's like, you can't treat all the infections all at once in these patients, especially because it's too much die-off. It's too much inflammation for them to handle. You really want to be able to isolate what are the most likely big ones that you need to treat first. Once they can detox, once they can drain the inflammation, once they have more mitochondrial energy, once they, have more brain functioning and they can handle things. So it's one of the players. Sometimes it's a primary, oftentimes it's more like a secondary issue unless the person has like an autoimmune like presentation or illness.
So Greg, one of the things we've discovered here during the course of our almost 300 podcast episodes is that we have to.
Wow, 300! You guys rock.
We are rocking with so many cool people, including now Greg Lee. So hey. We've learned that you can't just you're not going to heal if you don't treat the entire person, right? You have to treat the spirit, you have to treat the body, you have to treat the mind. There's an entire approach you have to take. And you've talked to us a lot about mindset today and emotions. You've talked a lot about the different skill sets that people can acquire. Now talk to us about network and what you folks over at the Lyme Research and Healing Center are doing with creating a network for folks who are going through a Lyme disease journey.
So I really find that, having, worked for over 25 years with chronic infection patients, that you can get significant improvement much more quickly because I did the protocols that I had available at the time and they were okay, they were good, but the patient would have the shoulder that wouldn't be better or the brain fog that wouldn't improve or the fatigue. And I found that I needed to go deeper than the protocols. And so that's when I started to say, okay, how do I share these results that may not be fitting into a protocol, but are really having great results in these patients that are seeing, 12 different Lyme docs or naturopaths or herbalists, and still are struggling with these different things. So it really, given my geeky NASA background, we would use electronic analysis of satellites to figure out issues and resolve them. So it was just like, hey, we can do the same thing here. And based on that, then we can come up with a more targeted remedy and treatment program. So the community is really about, how do I share the benefits of that knowledge and that wisdom with people who are looking for how to treat their patients more effectively, how to get better more quickly. So that's why we created this community called Heal for Real. And we do weekly trainings in there where we break down a topic. Like this month was Lyme detox. And so the first week we do, what are the basics? And then the second week we do a case study of, here's someone who really struggled with detoxing. And one of the things that this guy, he had really bad brain fog and he really struggled, and he went and saw one of the top Lyme docs in the country, and found out that every remedy that he was taking made him bedridden. He just couldn't take the medications. He couldn't even take the natural remedies. The only thing he could take was a little bit of Allicin, and that wouldn't flatten him out. And so it was just like, he was just so toxic and had so many blocks to his detoxing. When he came to me, he was like, can you help me? And I'm like, yeah, I think so. So we used different treatments like microcurrent, like cupping. Cupping was huge for this guy. That's one of the things where we actually put suction cups on and then take them off, needle, put the cups back on, and you pull out this toxic, inflamed, coagulated blood out of the person. And with this guy, when we did him on his head, he was just like, my brain was clear for weeks after you did that. And nothing else had done that. And he was, he owned a business, he has providing for his family, and he was just afraid that, I'm just not going to be able to make it. I can't function in my brain. And it was just, having the right detox remedies that can quickly help his brain to function, help him to eventually got to a point where, hey, my brain's working off, I want to sell this business. And he was able to sell it and have, be successful that way. And so, it was a great success story using different detox methods, giving detox remedies. And eventually, as he got more functional, then more antimicrobial, like homeopathics and herbals and essential oils, to help maintain him, because he lives probably about 4 or 5 hours away from us. So
who is this network available to, and how can folks join the network and learn from the various tools that you're making available?
Yeah, so we have a community called LymeResearchCenter.com, and in there we're going to create a special for Tick Bootcamp listeners, that LymeResearchCenter.com/Tick Bootcamp, no spaces, no dashes, just all letters together. And if you go there, you can get a special way to sign up and get your first month for free. We charge an annual or a monthly fee, and it's like $40 a month or $400 for the year. And we'll give you your first month free if you sign up. And there's a minimum of a 3-month initial. And in that, we're giving weekly trainings, like I mentioned, the basics, case studies, and then also what are the demonstrations of the different properties of the different remedies and treatments. So a lot of it is like, oh yeah, how do you use this remedy? How do you use, well, what delivery method? How is that, able to produce the results in the case study? And then, this week, actually this week we did, what are the top 16 detox methods? And that's all of this and our previous trainings are also available when someone gets to sign up, and they can get to over 40 trainings that we've done previously up to this point, in addition to the new monthly stuff that we're putting out. And then we have a community. And we're like, hey, what do you want to learn next month? We're not telling them. It's really what the biggest needs are in the community, and really tailoring training to those biggest needs.
So when folks join this community, they will then be able to give you input into what their needs are, and you're designing your training around what the community is collectively asking for as you move forward.
Yes, it's not meant to give medical advice or tell people what to do, because we can't do that unless they're a patient, and it doesn't make them a patient. This is more for saying, hey, these are remedies and treatments that are helping patients that may be like you. You need to go, before making any changes, consult with your medical providers, just, to keep ourselves safe, and make sure that people, they're becoming aware of these remedies, like, the essential oils or the treatments like hydrogen, or, these are making a big difference in mast cell, Lyme, Bartonella, and so on. So that's really.
So you're offering folks tools so they can develop their skill set, and they could use this information in conjunction with working with their practitioner to improve and I guess expand the options, treatment options that may be available to them.
Yeah. And also there are practitioners in there also who are working with patients in the community that are then using these with their patients to get results.
So of course, now that's the I guess the scaled version of working with your practice. How could folks work with you at the Lyme Research and Healing Center if they wanted to take the next step and have a closer relationship with you?
So there's the lymeresearchcenter.com/treatment, which explains what are the different services that we offer. And then at the bottom, there's a form on that page which says, tell us a little about your situation, how can we help you? And that way we then get that and then reach out to the people who submit that. That people can call us on our number, 301-228-3764. They can go and, those are the main ways that people inquire about how we may be able to help them.
Now, is the care that's offered, or the services that are offered by the Lyme Research and Healing Center, are they all in person, or do you have remote options, or is it a combination of the two?
So according to my licensing board, I need to see people for the first appointment, and then I can work more remotely with them. However, many of the treatments like microcurrent, hydrogen, cupping do require people to come into the office unless they find a practitioner near them that is able to provide those services. So we're able to work somewhat that way. And also, if people want to do a mainly remedy based, then we can work with them, with creating a remedy plan for them to help increase their, mitochondrial energy, detox, fight infections, drain inflammation, and so on.
So you've been really generous with your time. Our listeners, I know, are going to be, thrilled to learn all that you're teaching in this great podcast. So we're going to let you go, but I do have to ask you the final question that we ask every one of our guests in the Tick Boot Camp podcast. And God forbid somebody that you love came walking into your office right after this podcast and they had a tick biting them. What would you recommend that they do so they wouldn't have to go on a chronic Lyme disease journey?
Well, have they taken the tick out? So take the tick out, save it, get it tested. And then based on what's in the tick, you can make different find practitioners that are willing to treat you prophylactically based on that, and also be open to the treatments and remedies that aren't just standard care of just taking doxycycline or antibiotics, but that there are other remedies, treatments, and support communities out here like we have for here and Heal for Real, but also with Lyme support groups that you can get, some people that you connect with that, that can help you make more informed treatment decisions.
Wrigley, we thank you so much for taking time out of your really busy schedule to share so much of this brilliant information with the folks in the Tick Boot Camp community. And we really thank you for all the great work that's being done at the Lyme Research and Healing Center. So thank you, Greg, for all your good work.
It's been an honor. Thank you, Rich and Matt, for having me on. And I look forward to helping your community however I can.
Thank you for listening to our Tick Bootcamp interview with our guest, Greg Lee. To our listeners, we have a call to action. First, if you'd like to learn more about Greg, please visit his website at goodbyelyme.com. Second, if you've enjoyed this episode of our Tick Bootcamp podcast, please share it with your friends on social media. Third, Tick Bootcamp has created a Tick Bite blueprint that has been inspired by the information that has been shared with us by past podcast guests. We urge you to visit our website at tickbootcamp.com/bite to view our blueprint. Fourth, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify to get your automatic episode updates of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. Please take a minute to leave us an honest review on your podcast platform of choice. And finally, if you'd like to search our podcast library of almost 300 episodes, subscribe to our email list, or share feedback with us, please visit our website at tickbootcamp.com. Thank you, as always, for listening.